The yellow school bus, a lumbering metal beast exhaling diesel fumes, shuddered to a halt, its brakes hissing like a disgruntled serpent. Rain lashed against the windows, blurring the already gray and oppressive cityscape of Queens, New York. Inside, a cacophony of adolescent noise, shouts, laughter, the thud of backpacks, the squeak of sneakers on the worn linoleum floor filled the air. For Mateo Reyes, a slender boy with wary, intelligent eyes and a mop of jet black hair that constantly threatened to obscure his vision, it was the soundtrack of his personal daily nightmare. He was the new kid, the provinciano fresh off the plane from the Philippines, and every jostle, every snicker, every sideways glance felt like a targeted attack, a pinprick to his already deflated sense of belonging. He clutched his worn-out copy of The Outsiders, a gift from his Lolo grandfather before he left Manila, its pages dog-eared and soft from repeated readings, the spine cracked and held together with layers of tape. It was a flimsy shield, a literary talisman against the stares, the whispers that followed him like a persistent, unwanted shadow. Fresh off the boat, he'd heard someone mutter earlier, the words dripping with casual cruelty. Bet he eats dog. Another voice laced with cruel amusement had added, look at his clothes. Did his mom find them in a dumpster? Salvation Army reject. Mateo knew it was a lie. His mother had painstakingly chosen those clothes, sacrificing her own needs to ensure he had something presentable for his first day at Jackson Heights High. But the truth didn't matter in this arena of teenage judgment. Mateo kept his gaze fixed on the blurry image of the Chrysler building in the distance, a silver needle piercing the stormy, bruised purple sky. He tried to channel his Lolo's words, repeated like a mantra, a prayer, before he boarded the plane that would carry him across the ocean. Maging matapeng ka apo, huwag manghayang apakin ka nila, ipakita mo sa kanila ang lakas and loob mo. Be brave, grandson, don't let them step on you, show them your courage. But bravery felt like a distant, unattainable luxury, a shimmering mirage in the desert of his current reality. He felt anything but brave. He felt small, insignificant, a tiny leaf caught in a relentless urban storm. The bus lurched again, throwing him slightly against the cold, condensation-streaked window. A beefy hand belonging to a boy named Brock, a hulking figure with a sneer permanently etched on his face, a face that seemed to have been sculpted from granite and bad intentions, slammed down on the worn vinyl seat beside him. Mateo flinched involuntarily, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The scent of stale sweat and cheap cologne, Brock's signature aroma, filled his nostrils. Hey, new kid, Brock drawled, his voice a low growl that resonated with menace. You got anything good to eat? My boy Kevin here is starving. He gestured with a thick thumb to a skinny kid with a weasel-like face and perpetually darting eyes who was currently picking his nose with an unsettling degree of focus and dedication. Kevin, Brock's ever-present shadow, a sycophant of the highest order. Mateo shook his head, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement, clutching his lunch bag, a simple bawan of rice and adobo, carefully prepared by his Lola Alina, tighter to his chest. He knew what was coming. This had become a daily ritual, a twisted, predictable form of hazing orchestrated by Brock and his small, pathetic court. Chad, a lanky basketball player with a perpetually vacant stare, and a dribbling problem that extended beyond the court, and Tiffany, a surprisingly intelligent but deeply mean-spirited girl with sharp, feline eyes and a tongue that could cut deeper than any blade. Tiffany seemed to derive a perverse pleasure from watching Mateo's discomfort, a silent spectator to his daily humiliation. Nothing, Brock feigned surprise, his small, piggish eyes narrowing. Not even a little. What do you people eat, Balat? He made a gagging sound, a theatrical display of disgust, and Kevin, ever the loyal echo, erupted in a fit of snorting, high-pitched laughter that sounded like a strangled hyena. Mateo remained silent, his jaw clenched so tightly he thought his teeth might crack. He knew any response, any sign of weakness, any flicker of defiance would only fuel their cruelty, add another log to the bonfire of his torment. He focused on the rhythmic squeak of the windshield wipers, trying to drown out the taunts, the jeers, the insidious whispers that seemed to seep into the very fabric of the bus. He imagined himself back in the Philippines, in his Lolo's small, sun-drenched garden, surrounded by the scent of sampaguita and the comforting sound of his Lolo's voice. It was a fleeting, fragile escape. Maybe he's got some of that weird fish sauce, Chad chimed in, wrinkling his nose in exaggerated disgust. Smells like feet, like really, really bad feet. Tiffany, who had been observing the scene with a detached, almost bored air, suddenly leaned forward, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly on the back of the seat in front of her. "Leave him alone, guys," she said, her voice surprisingly soft, a stark contrast to her usual sharp, sarcastic tone. "He's not worth it. Seriously, it's pathetic." Mateo glanced at her, surprised, a flicker of confused hope momentarily illuminating the darkness. This was the first time she had ever shown anything remotely resembling sympathy, or at least, a lack of outright hostility. Was it a trap, a new, more subtle level of their cruel game, a way to lull him into a false sense of security before delivering an even more devastating blow? Brock, however, seemed genuinely taken aback, his perpetually furrowed brow deepening. "What's gotten into you, Tiff?" he asked, his voice laced with suspicion and a hint of hurt. He clearly valued Tiffany's approval, her participation in his reign of terror. Tiffany shrugged, a delicate, almost elegant movement of her shoulders. "Just bored, I guess. It's getting old. Watching you torment the new kid every day is like watching reruns of a really bad sitcom. It was funny the first time, maybe the second, but now it's just sad." She turned back to her phone, her face unreadable, a mask of carefully cultivated indifference. Brock momentarily deflated, his bullying momentum stalled, muttered something unintelligible under his breath and turned away, his shoulders slumping slightly. The bus, as if sensing the shift in the dynamic, finally reached Mateo's stop, a nondescript corner in a predominantly Hispanic neighborhood, a vibrant tapestry of bodegas, murals, and the lively chatter of Spanish. He practically bolted off the bus, a surge of relief flooding through him, even though he knew the reprieve was temporary, a fleeting moment of peace before the storm resumed. He walked the 2 blocks to his family's small apartment, the relentless rain plastering his hair to his forehead, chilling him to the bone. The building was old, the brick facade faded and crumbling, the paint peeling in long, sad strips, but it was home. The aroma of garlic and soy sauce, the familiar, comforting sounds of Tagalog being spoken, greeted him as he stepped inside, a warm embrace against the cold indifference of the outside world. His Lola Alina, a tiny woman with a surprisingly strong grip and a spine of steel, was waiting for him, her wrinkled face etched with concern. She saw the look in his eyes, the subtle slump of his shoulders, the way he held himself, a mixture of exhaustion and quiet despair, and immediately knew. "Anak, what happened?" she asked, her voice full of concern, her Tagalog a soothing balm to his wounded spirit. Mateo tried to force a smile, a weak, watery imitation of happiness. "Nothing, Lola, just a long day, a lot of homework." But Lola Alina wasn't fooled. She had seen that same look on her late husband's face, a veteran of the Hukbalahap rebellion, a man who had faced down far greater threats than school bullies, a man who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. She gently took his face in her hands, her touch surprisingly strong, her skin papery thin but radiating warmth. "Mateo," she said, her voice firm but gentle, her eyes filled with a wisdom that spanned generations. "Remember what your Lolo always said, strength isn't just about muscles, it's not about being the biggest or the loudest. It's about spirit, it's about resilience. It's about refusing to let the darkness extinguish your light. And you, Apo, you have the spirit of a warrior. You have the blood of Lapu-Lapu flowing through your veins." He wanted to believe her, he really did. He desperately wanted to believe that he possessed some hidden wellspring of strength, some inner warrior waiting to be unleashed. But the memory of Brock's sneer, the sound of Kevin's mocking laughter, the casual cruelty of Chad's remarks still echoed in his ears, a relentless chorus of negativity that threatened to drown out his Lola's words of encouragement. He knew that tomorrow the cycle would begin again. The bus ride, the stares, the whispers, the taunts. It was a predictable, agonizing routine. He went to his room, a small, cramped space that barely fit a bed, a desk, and a small dresser, but it was his sanctuary. He opened his backpack and pulled out his homework, spreading it across the desk, but his mind wasn't on quadratic equations or the symbolism in the scarlet letter. He was thinking about the way Brock had looked at him, the way his eyes seemed to strip away his dignity, leaving him feeling exposed and vulnerable. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging within him. He remembered his Lolo's training, the hours they had spent practicing Arnis, the traditional Filipino martial art, the rhythmic click of the sticks, the fluid movements, the discipline, the focus. It had felt like a dance, a conversation between body and spirit. He hadn't practiced since he arrived in New York, too afraid, too ashamed, too worried about drawing even more attention to himself. But now a spark of defiance flickered within him, a tiny ember of resistance against the overwhelming darkness. He looked at his hands, turning them over and over, examining them as if seeing them for the first time. They were slender, almost delicate, but he knew they possessed a strength that belied their appearance. He remembered the feel of the baston, the smooth, hard wood in his grip, the way it felt like an extension of his own arm. He stood up and walked to the small, dusty mirror hanging on the back of his door. He looked at his reflection, at the boy staring back at him, a boy who looked lost and afraid. But beneath the surface, he saw something else. A flicker of determination, a hint of the warrior his Lola believed him to be. He began to move slowly at first, mimicking the stances, the strikes, the blocks he had learned from his Lolo. The movements were rusty, hesitant, but as he continued, a sense of familiarity, of muscle memory began to return. He felt a warmth spread through his body, a sense of power, of control that he hadn't felt in weeks. He practiced for hours, the rain outside a steady drumbeat against the window pane, the sounds of the city fading into the background. He imagined Brock, Kevin, Chad, their faces contorted in expressions of mockery, and he used their image as fuel, channeling his anger, his frustration, his humiliation into his movements. He wasn't just practicing Arnis, he was reclaiming his dignity, his self-respect, his sense of self. He was fighting back not with fists and violence, but with skill, with discipline, with the spirit of his ancestors. He was unaware of the security cameras, discreetly placed at every corner of his school's exterior, their lenses constantly recording the comings and goings of students and staff. And he was even less aware of the old, retired NYPD detective, Mr. O'Malley, who lived in the apartment building across the street and spent his days meticulously reviewing the footage, a hobby born out of boredom and a lingering, almost obsessive sense of civic duty. He'd noticed Mateo, the quiet new kid, and the consistent, almost ritualistic pattern of harassment he endured. He'd seen the way Brock and his crew cornered him, the way they surrounded him, their body language radiating menace. He'd also noticed something else, the almost unnatural grace with which Mateo moved, a fluidity, a subtle economy of motion that hinted at something more than just youthful agility. Something that reminded him of the martial arts masters he'd encountered during his years on the force, the men who could move with lightning speed and devastating power. He'd seen the way Mateo flinched, the way he tried to make himself smaller to disappear, but he'd also seen the flicker of something else in his eyes, a spark of defiance, a hint of hidden strength. Mr. O'Malley, a man who trusted his instincts, a man who had seen enough of the world to know that appearances could be deceiving, made a mental note to keep a closer eye on the new kid. He had a feeling, a gut feeling, that there was more to Mateo Reyes than met the eye. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the remnants of the previous day's storm washed away, leaving behind a sky of brilliant, almost painfully bright blue. The city of New York seemed to shimmer with a deceptive freshness, a veneer of cleanliness that masked the underlying grit and chaos. But for Mateo Reyes, the beauty of the day was overshadowed by the knot of anxiety that had taken up permanent residence in his stomach. The previous night's Arnis practice, the rediscovery of his Lolo's teachings, had instilled a flicker of confidence, a spark of defiance, but the reality of facing Brock and his cronies on the school bus loomed large, a dark cloud on his personal horizon. He walked to the bus stop with a deliberate slowness, his senses heightened, acutely aware of every sound, every movement around him. He clutched his worn copy of The Outsiders, the familiar weight of the book a small comfort in the face of the impending confrontation. He tried to visualize his Lolo's calm, steady gaze to hear his voice, a low rumble of encouragement. Tandon mo apo ang tunay na lakas I wala sa laki ng katawan, kundi nasa tibe ng loob. Remember, grandson, true strength is not in the size of the body, but in the strength of the spirit. The yellow school bus materialized around the corner, its appearance as predictable and unwelcome as a recurring nightmare. He boarded, scanning the interior for Brock's hulking figure, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He chose a seat near the back, hopping to blend into the background to become invisible, but it was a futile effort. Brock, with his uncanny radar for vulnerability, his seemingly innate ability to sniff out weakness, spotted him immediately. A slow, predatory grin, the kind that promised trouble, spread across his face, crinkling the corners of his small, piggish eyes. Kevin, ever the faithful shadow, the sycophantic echo, mirrored the expression, his eyes gleaming with a malicious anticipation that sent a shiver down Mateo's spine. Well, Brock drawled, his voice a low rumble that carried across the noisy bus, silencing the other conversations. He sauntered down the aisle with a deliberate swagger, his bulk filling the narrow space, his presence radiating a palpable sense of menace. Look who's back for more. Did you bring us any of that exotic cuisine today, new kid? Maybe some of those crunchy insects, or that fermented fish that smells like a locker room after a football game. Mateo didn't respond, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery, the blur of buildings and faces a meaningless distraction. He felt his hands clench into fists, his knuckles white against the worn fabric of his jeans. He could feel the eyes of the other students on him, a mixture of curiosity, amusement, and a sickening sense of pity, the kind that only amplified his feelings of isolation and humiliation. Chad, who was sitting a few rows ahead, twisted around in his seat, his lanky frame contorting into an awkward angle. Maybe he brought some dried squid, he offered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. That stuff smells like a dead animal, like seriously a rotting carcass left out in the sun. Kevin erupted in his signature hyena-like laugh, a high-pitched, grating sound that echoed through the bus. Tiffany, however, remained conspicuously silent, her gaze fixed on the screen of her phone, her expression unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of indifference. Was she bored, disgusted, or was there a flicker of something else hidden beneath the surface? Mateo couldn't tell, and he didn't have the energy to try to decipher her enigmatic behavior. Brock stopped directly in front of Mateo's seat, blocking his view, his shadow falling over him like a shroud. "I'm talking to you, Provinciano," he said, his voice hardening, losing its playful edge. "Don't you have any manners? Don't you know how to show respect to your superiors?" He emphasized the word superiors with a sneer, making it clear that he considered himself to be in a position of dominance, of inherent authority. Mateo finally looked up, meeting Brock's gaze directly. He felt a surge of anger, a hot, burning wave that threatened to consume him, but it was tempered by a newfound calmness, a sense of control, a quiet strength that he hadn't felt before, a legacy of his Lolo's training and the long hours spent practicing in his room the previous night. His Lolo's words echoed in his mind, a mantra against the fear. Huwag kang matakot. Ipakita mo ang iyang lakas. Hindi sa pamamagitan ng dahas, kundi sa pamamagitan ng tapang at karanungan. Don't be afraid, show your strength, not through violence but through courage and wisdom. "I have nothing for you," Mateo said, his voice surprisingly steady even to his own ears. He was surprised by his own composure, by the lack of tremor in his voice. Brock's grin widened, revealing a glimpse of crooked, yellowed teeth. "Oh, I think you do. You have something that belongs to me, respect, and I'm going to take it, one way or another." He reached out, his large, meaty hand aiming for Mateo's lunch bag, the bawon prepared with love by his Lola Alina. In that instant, everything changed. The weeks of pent-up frustration, the humiliation, the fear, the feeling of being an outsider, all of it coalesced into a single, explosive moment. Mateo's training, his hours of practice, his Lolo's spirit, the blood of generations of Filipino warriors all converged. He moved with a speed and precision that surprised even himself, a blur of motion that defied his seemingly frail physique. He intercepted Brock's hand, his grip like a steel trap, his fingers wrapping around Brock's thick wrist with a surprising strength. Brock yelped a sound of surprise and pain, his eyes widening in disbelief. He tried to pull his hand free to break Mateo's grip, but it was like trying to pull his arm out of a vice. Mateo held firm, his slender fingers exerting a pressure that seemed impossible given his size. The bus fell silent, the usual cacophony of adolescent noise replaced by a stunned, breathless hush. The other students stared in disbelief, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and awe. "Let go," Brock growled, his voice losing its bravado, its confident swagger replaced by a note of pain and desperation. His face, usually flushed with arrogance, began to turn an alarming shade of red. Mateo didn't release his grip. He maintained eye contact with Brock, his gaze unwavering, his expression calm but resolute. He was no longer the scared, intimidated new kid. He was something else, something more. He was the embodiment of his Lolo's teachings, the inheritor of a proud warrior tradition. "Apologize," he said, his voice low but firm, carrying across the silent bus. "What?" Brock sputtered, his face contorted in a mixture of confusion and pain. He couldn't believe what was happening. He, Brock, the king of the school bus, the undisputed ruler of his social domain, was being challenged, being defeated by the new Filipino kid. The quiet, unassuming Provinciano he had dismissed as weak and insignificant. "Apologize," Mateo repeated, increasing the pressure on Brock's wrist with a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. It was a precise application of Arnis technique, a manipulation of pressure points that amplified the pain exponentially. "Apologize for everything. For the insults, for the bullying, for making me feel unwelcome, for trying to take what isn't yours. Apologize to everyone on this bus for your behavior." Brock struggled, his muscles straining against Mateo's grip, but it was useless. He was trapped, caught in a web of his own making. He glanced around at the other students, his usual confident, arrogant gaze replaced by a look of desperation, of pleading. He saw only stunned silence, a sea of faces frozen in expressions of disbelief. Even Kevin and Chad, his loyal lieutenants, seemed to be at a loss for words, their usual smirks replaced by expressions of confusion and fear. Tiffany was watching, her eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and, could it be, admiration, respect? Mateo couldn't be sure, but there was definitely something different in her gaze, something that went beyond her usual detached amusement. Okay, Brock finally gasped, his voice cracking with pain and humiliation. I apologize, I'm sorry for everything, just let go of my wrist." He looked around at the other students, his face a mask of shame. "I apologize to everyone for being a jerk." Mateo released his grip and Brock stumbled back, cradling his wrist, his face contorted in pain. He looked at Mateo with a mixture of fear, resentment, and a begrudging respect. The sneer was gone, replaced by something akin to humility, a recognition that he had been defeated not by brute force but by skill, by discipline, by something he didn't understand. The bus ride continued in an almost unnerving silence, the atmosphere completely transformed. The usual boisterous energy had dissipated, replaced by a palpable tension, a sense of awe and disbelief. Mateo felt a wave of relief, of liberation wash over him. He had stood up for himself not with violence but with skill and courage, with the quiet strength he had inherited from his Lolo. He had shown them his strength, not the strength of muscles but the strength of spirit. When he arrived at school, he walked with a newfound confidence, his head held high, his shoulders straight. He no longer felt like an outsider, a target, a victim. He felt like he belonged, like he had earned his place. He had faced his fear and emerged victorious. Mr. O'Malley, meticulously reviewing the security footage from the bus as he did every morning, leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. He had seen the whole thing, the subtle shift in Mateo's demeanor, the lightning-fast movement, the controlled power, the precise application of martial arts technique. He had seen the look on Brock's face, the moment of realization, the moment when the bully realized he had met his match, that he had underestimated the quiet new kid. Well, Mr. O'Malley muttered to himself, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "Looks like the little Provinciano has some fight in him after all, just like his grandfather, I bet." He had done some digging, some discreet inquiries after noticing Mateo's movements on the security tapes. He had learned about Mateo's Lolo, about his history as a Hukbalahap fighter, about his mastery of Arnis. He had a feeling, a gut instinct, that this was just the beginning of Mateo's story. The whispers started almost immediately, spreading through the hallways of Jackson Heights High like wildfire. Did you hear what happened on the bus? The new Filipino kid, he totally took down Brock. Brock, seriously, no way. Yeah, man, he grabbed his wrist, and I don't know, did some kind of ninja move or something. Like a ninja, seriously. Yeah, it was crazy, everyone was freaking out. I heard he knows some kind of secret martial art. Arnis, it's called Arnis. Arnis, what's that? It's Filipino, like with sticks and stuff, but he didn't even need sticks, he just used his hands. As Mateo walked through the halls, he noticed the difference. The stairs were still there, but they were different now. No longer hostile, no longer mocking, no longer filled with pity. They were stares of curiosity, of respect, even a little bit of awe, a hint of fear. Some kids even gave him nods of acknowledgement, a silent recognition of his courage, his unexpected strength. It was a complete reversal of his previous experience, a dramatic shift in the social dynamics of the school. Lunchtime, usually the most treacherous part of the day, the arena where social hierarchies were most brutally enforced, was the next test. The cafeteria, a cacophony of noise and activity, felt different. As Mateo walked to an empty table, his tray laden with his Lola's adobo and rice, a few kids he'd never spoken to before, kids who had previously ignored him or treated him with indifference, made space for him. Hey Mateo, right? One of them, a boy named Alex, said, his voice friendly and welcoming. Mind if we join you? We heard what happened on the bus. That was pretty awesome. Mateo, surprised by the unexpected invitation, nodded, a shy smile spreading across his face. He was soon surrounded by a group of students, a diverse mix of backgrounds and ethnicities, all eager to hear his story, to learn more about the quiet new kid who had dared to stand up to the school bully. He recounted the bus incident, downplaying his own skill, emphasizing his desire to be treated with respect, his refusal to be intimidated. Even Tiffany, surprisingly, approached him later that day, her usual entourage of mean girls conspicuously absent. She stood before him, her arms crossed, her expression different. It wasn't her usual sarcastic smirk, nor was it the detached indifference she usually displayed. It was something softer, something curious. That was impressive, she said, her voice surprisingly devoid of her usual sharp, cutting tone. What you did on the bus, where did you learn to do that? Mateo hesitated for a moment, unsure whether to trust her, whether this was another one of her cruel games, but he decided to be honest, to take a chance. My grandfather, he said, his voice quiet but firm. He taught me Arnis, a Filipino martial art. It's part of our culture, our heritage. Tiffany nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful, her gaze fixed on his face. Arnis, she repeated, the word sounding foreign and exotic on her tongue. Maybe you could show me sometime, she asked, a hint of vulnerability, a flicker of genuine interest in her voice. It was a request, not a demand, a tentative offer of friendship, or at least of understanding. Mateo smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. Maybe, he said, I'd like that. The following week saw a dramatic, almost unbelievable transformation in Mateo's life at Jackson Heights High. He was no longer the bullied new kid, the invisible outsider, the target of ridicule and harassment. He was Mateo, the quiet, unassuming boy with the hidden talent, the unexpected strength, the courage to stand up for himself. He became a symbol of hope, of resilience for other students who felt marginalized, who felt like they didn't belong. He started an informal Arnis club after school, meeting in the old, unused gymnasium, teaching a diverse group of students, including Tiffany, who turned out to be a surprisingly dedicated and skilled student, the basic techniques of Arnis. He shared his culture, his heritage, his Lolo's teachings with a new generation of students, bridging cultural divides, building connections, fostering a sense of community. The club became a haven, a place where students from different backgrounds could come together, learn from each other, and support each other. Brock, meanwhile, kept his distance. He still glared at Mateo from time to time, his eyes filled with a mixture of resentment and grudging respect, but the fire had gone out of his bullying gaze. He had learned a valuable lesson, a painful lesson, but a necessary one. That strength comes in many forms, that judging someone based on their appearance or background is a fool's game, that true power lies not in brute force, but in inner resilience, in skill, in discipline, in the courage to stand up for what's right. He had even, after several weeks of observing from afar, swallowing his pride, begun to attend some of the Arnis club sessions. Standing at the back of the gymnasium, watching Mateo teach, a flicker of something that might have been admiration or perhaps even envy in his eyes. Mr. O'Malley, watching the Arnis club through his binoculars from his apartment window across the street, a habit he had developed, smiled to himself, a deep, satisfied smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He had seen it all before during his years on the force, the bullies, the victims, the endless cycle of violence and retribution. But he had also seen the power of resilience, the ability of the human spirit to overcome adversity, the transformative power of compassion and understanding. He saw in Mateo a reminder that even in the darkest of corners, hope could flourish, that even in the most unlikely of places, heroes could emerge, and that sometimes all it took was a little bit of courage, a lot of skill, and the unwavering spirit of a Filipino warrior to turn the tables, to change the world, one school bus, one gymnasium, one student at a time. He witnessed with a sense of profound satisfaction the culmination of Mateo's journey, a scene that played out several months later. Brock, finally humbled, having undergone his own personal growth, his own internal transformation, approached Mateo after an Arnis club session. He stood before Mateo, his head bowed slightly, his voice low and hesitant. "Mateo," he said, I wanted to apologize for everything, for the way I treated you, for the things I said, for being a complete jerk. He looked up, meeting Mateo's gaze, his eyes filled with a sincerity that Mateo had never seen before. "I was wrong, I was insecure, and I took it out on you. I'm truly sorry." Mateo looked at Brock, studying his face, searching for any sign of insincerity, any hint of the old arrogance. But he saw only genuine remorse, a genuine desire for forgiveness. He extended his hand. "Apology accepted, Brock," Mateo said, his voice firm but kind. Brock took Mateo's hand, shaking it firmly. They stood there for a moment, not as enemies, not as bully and victim, but as fellow students, fellow practitioners of Arnis, bound by a shared experience, a shared respect for the art, and a newfound respect for each other.